Okay, thanks for joining us this morning. My name's Ryan Davidock. I'm the supervisor for the Planning, Zoning, and Land Use Unit here in Oakland County. Welcome to our first virtual planners gathering of the year. The draft MEP stormwater standards are maximum extent practical. Just a few reminders, the meeting's being recorded and we'll make it available on our website. If you have questions during the presentation, please use the chat function in Zoom and direct your questions to Jim Schaefer. Jim will moderate a question and answer period at the end of the presentation. And there'll also be a point in the presentation when the presenters will ask for your interaction. So we'll ask you at that point to unmute yourselves for those specific questions that they have for you. So let's get started. It's my pleasure to introduce our presenters. Today we have Daniel Christian, a senior project manager from Tetra Tech, and Lynn Seymour, chief engineer from Oakland County Water Resources Commissioner's Office. So Lynn, the floor is yours.
All right, well, thanks, Ryan. One moment here, my screen is gone kind of crazy here. So I wanted to kick off our presentation with an overview of our engineering stormwater standards, and then I'll turn it over to Dan to kind of go over the requirements for meeting our volume reducing best management practices to the maximum extent practicable, or MEP, when sites are issued an infiltration waiver due to verified poor infiltrating soils. So as of November 2023, we are aware of 22 communities who have adopted or intend to adopt Oakland County standards in full or in part. And so it's for this reason that it's important for us to present at the planners gathering, because we want to make sure we get your input on our proposed approach. You'll see on the slides that they're draft, and that's because we're looking for feedback before we finalize. And then these MEP requirements that we present today have the potential to impact site design at the local level for at least the 22 communities in Oakland County that have adopted our standards in full or in part. And then finally, if time allows after the presentation and Q&A, I'll give a quick overview of a new pilot program that we launched in the southeast portion of the county called Rain Smart Rebates. This project or pilot provides rebates to eligible homeowners in the George W. Kuhn Drainage District to install native trees or install rain gardens or rain barrels. Okay, Dan, you can go to the next slide. So our current standards were adopted in May of 2021. They're commonly referred to the new standards, but really they've been in place for now 3 years. They were developed in close coordination with Livingston, Macomb, and Wayne counties, and this resulted in a relatively consistent set of standards across Metro Detroit. And then since the adoption of the standards, WRC has continued engaging with stakeholders as we continue implementation. And one way we've done this is by creating the Oakland County Stormwater Standards Work Group, which consists of municipal representatives, consulting engineers, and regional agencies. And we started that back in January 2022. The purpose of this group is to provide a forum and to facilitate a coordinated, consistent approach to implementing our stormwater standards throughout the county. We also host pre-application meetings to answer questions a design engineer or developer may have regarding their site. And then finally, to kind of continue on with improved implementation, we hired Tetra Tech to assist WRC with updating our soil erosion and sedimentation control manual, and that'll help us develop appropriate requirements to protect these infiltration areas during construction. Next slide, Dan. So what is the applicability? Well, in order to protect all the water resources under WRC's stormwater jurisdiction, we do require that these standards be implemented for development and redevelopment projects, both inside and outside the regulated MS4 area. As you see here, it applies to development and redevelopment greater or equal to 1 acre, or whether it's a part of a common plan or development. There are some exemptions. These aren't all of them, but some of the common ones you'll see which roads typically have this if you're just resurfacing asphalt, concrete, or similar surface. Commonly, you talk about like a mill and fill. As long as you're not exposing the aggregate, subgrade, or replace the on-site drainage area or drainage system, you would be exempt. And then, if you have a maintenance project, emergency maintenance, and it's for being done to protect public health and safety, that may fall under an exemption. Next slide. Core design requirements. So I'll try not to get too technical here. Just kind of give a quick overview of what the main factors are when we're going into our design requirements. So channel protection and volume control. This requirement is necessary to help protect our natural water courses from increased erosion and sedimentation as a result of that increased imperviousness and runoff volumes that occurs with development. It helps to promote groundwater recharge, helps to stabilize flow rates and base flow in our natural water courses. And it also helps to address water quality control criteria for our total suspended solids. This is the requirement that really the infiltration part falls into. So as we talk about the MEP requirements, it's under this channel protection volume control. And then quickly, channel protection rate control. You see there 1.9 inches. That's based on the 2-year 24-hour storm event. Water quality control. That focuses on limiting the concentration of total suspended solids. And a lot of times you hear the amounts or technical terms of 80 milligrams per liter or 80% TSS reduction. Examples that this can be achieved through are through the infiltration BMPs, like I mentioned earlier, mechanical separators, or having a sediment forebay when you combine it with extended detention. And then detention and flood control. That's the critical component in stormwater design to kind of reduce the likelihood of flooding downstream of the development. And we require that you manage the 100-year peak flow runoff. Next slide. So O&M, operation and maintenance. So when it's a county project or county-owned system, whether it's the Water Resources Commissioner, Oakland County Parks and Recreation, or the county as a whole, that's when the maintenance falls on us. But for most other cases, non-county stormwater systems, the community is responsible for the enforcement of the O&M as outlined in their stormwater management agreement, O&M agreement, and their MS4 permit. Next slide. So the SEMCOG tool, I just want to give a quick plug for this. This is something that we worked with SEMCOG to develop to help with reporting and tracking of your post-construction requirements to EGLE. Many communities or MS4 permittees need to report annually on April 1st. So this is an easy way to input all the data, and SEMCOG will correlate the data, summarize it, and send it back to you for uploading to EGLE. There is a deadline of February 16th for SEMCOG to be able to put all the information together and send it back to you. But if you have any questions, Katie Grantham is a great resource, and she can answer any questions you may have. But some of the information tracked, just for reference, would be a description of your stormwater system, drainage area, maybe what your short-term, long-term maintenance tasks are, the schedule associated with it, and then the frequencies, responsibilities. So next slide. At this point, I'm going to turn it over to Dan to talk about MEP.
Thanks, Lynn. So just to start off, we recognize that the planners represent an important part of this process. Often what we find is when the engineering group sees the site plan with the stormwater improvements laid out, the site plan's already, 90 or 100% complete, and there's really not a lot of opportunity for changes. So that's where we really want to put a plug in and encourage the planners to understand these rules And when you're talking with the developers early on in the process, maybe keep some of these ideas in the back of your mind, specifically when we look at things like conservation areas or saving trees. These are important and these can come into play with the proposed MEP rules. As Lynn mentioned, what we're talking about here is when a site gets an infiltration waiver, and they get an infiltration waiver when the infiltration rates are so low that infiltration is deemed impracticable. And that is set at a threshold of 0.24 inches per hour. That's when we switch to this volume reducing practices implemented to the maximum extent practicable, or MEP. We didn't make up this term. The state of Michigan didn't make up this term. It actually comes out of the Clean Water Act. So there's a long history about MEP. And MEP practices can be both structural as well as non-structural in nature. It is an iterative standard, so it tends to change over time as our knowledge and awareness improves. So here's the crux of what we're proposing as MEP requirements. And again, this only applies to those sites that have that infiltration is deemed impracticable. What we're proposing is that a site will be required to implement BMP's equivalent to 15% of the proposed impervious area. So if you have a site with 100,000 square feet of impervious, we're proposing that you would need 15,000 square feet of MEP area. And we've defined the term MEP area as that. So to help with the process, we have identified a list of pre-approved BMPs that can be used to meet the MEP requirement. You still have the option of coming in with some other idea that will help reduce the volume in some fashion. But in an effort to try to make things simple, we wanted to have a list of pre-approved ideas. So those pre-approved BMPs include those listed here on the chart: trees, native plantings, some conservation areas, both woodlands and wetlands, vegetated roofs, some naturalized ponds, and a special case use of bioretentions. And what we did is you can plant, say, native plantings. You can plant that in anywhere on the site. And if there's no runoff being directed to the native plantings or the MEP area, then the native plantings account for a 1-to-1 credit. So if you plant 1 square foot of native plantings, you get the equivalent of 1 square foot credit for the MEP area. But if you design the site such that you're draining water to the native plantings, then you get a 50% bonus credit. So 1 square foot of native plantings is equivalent to 1.5 square feet of MEP credit area. And we'll go over some details on each of these BMPs in just a second. The last thing I want to mention is this idea of maximum credit. So specifically, this applies to the conservation areas. We really want to encourage and promote the conservation of wetlands and woodlands, but at the same time, we want to see people do other improvements on site, not just conservation areas. So we put a cap on how much of the MEP required area can be credited to these conservation practices, and that cap is 50% as proposed. And then, like I said, we're just going to walk through each one of these BMPs and just provide a little bit more detail. Starting with the trees. Trees provide a really wonderful benefit to the site amenities, but they also provide a lot of stormwater benefits. And so we really want to promote the use of trees. In order to equate the trees to an MEP area, we look at the canopy area of the tree. And we look at that, and to help out, we broke the trees into 3 categories: small, medium, and large. And we defined the relative tree size based on the height of the tree is expected to reach at maturity. And then we assigned an equivalent MEP area per tree, and that sort of represents the canopy area of that tree after about 10 years of growth. To further help, we took a commonly used tree list, I believe from the Parks Department, and we went through that list and we identified the height of each species at maturity and assigned the relative tree size, the small, medium, and large, and then the MEP area. So, you know, a balsam fir is a large tree, and you would get a credit of 500 square feet per tree for each and every tree that you plant on a site. The other issue is the native plantings on the slide. The native plantings, we're just referencing other manuals on what native species are promoted in Michigan. So for example, the LID manual that SIMCOG put together for MSU Extension. Oh, I also wanted to mention that going back to the subject of trees, there's a special case that when we're building sites, when we're doing roadway improvement projects, it oftentimes is really hard to achieve some of these the stormwater requirements. And so in the roadway projects, we also want to promote the use of saving trees instead of cutting them down. And so in the case of public roadway projects, we're allowing existing trees to be counted towards the MEP area. When we do that, the trees must be in good health. So we want an arborist, a certified ISA arborist, to inspect the tree and make sure that it's in good health. And then you can count that as part of your MEP area. We have some examples at the end of this presentation that we'll go through and show how this works. So with the conservation areas, we want to conserve both the woodlands and the wetlands, but we want conservation areas that are in good health. So we're requiring that either a wetland scientist or an arborist, as appropriate, inspect the conservation areas. We're looking for things that are, you know, not overrun by invasive species. We're looking for things that are in relatively good health in order to be counted towards conservation areas. The conservation of naturalized ponds, you know, that refers to existing water bodies or ponds that are on site. And it could be a constructed pond of some form as well. The idea with ponds is we tend to get a lot of evaporation off of them, so they can achieve some stormwater volume reductions. And then I mentioned already, but you're limited to 50% of the MEP credit associated with conservation practices. A couple other practices, the vegetated roofs. I know this isn't very commonly used, but maybe we can help promote additional use of them. But you know, a square foot of vegetated roof will count as a square foot of MEP area. All vegetated roofs need to be evaluated for the structural capacity. So, and that's not unique to this MEP requirement. That's just good practice all around. Bioretentions, you can also build a bioretention on clay soils. The challenge is in any of these practices, you have to have a way to make sure that the water is drained away within a reasonable period of time. So typically with a bioretention, that means putting the underdrain at the bottom of the bioretention. And then, like I said, here we have a few examples just to kind of walk through this process. This first example focuses on, a single-family residential type development along a street. So in this case, we say the total development area is 286,000 square feet. We look at all of the different types of imperviouses, buildings, roadways, driveways, sidewalks, add it all up. We have 177,000 square feet. So if you take 15% of that 177,000 square feet, you get 26,550. So that is the area, the equivalent area of BMPs that we're looking to achieve on the site in order to meet the MEP requirement. The maximum allowable conservation areas is half of that, so we're allowing up to 13,000 square feet of conservation areas. So this particular site example conserved existing wetlands on a corner of the site, about 10,600 square feet. We planted native plantings in this cul-de-sac in the middle, but we're not directing water to it, so this could be a raised cul-de-sac. And then we're proposing to plant 24 medium trees, so you get 300 square foot credit per medium tree, and 8 large trees, so you get 500 square foot per large tree. And that all adds up to about 11,200 square feet. So when you add up all 3 of these different practices, you can see that we met our 26,000 square foot required area. So we're good. Example 2 is similar to 1. This is more of a multifamily development. We're using, again, we start with the total development site, we add up our impervious, we calculate our MEP area as 15% of the total impervious. And we can just write down what our 50% conservation area cap is, in this case 8625. So this particular site is only using, it looks like the left-hand half of the site for the development. We have a lot of conservation areas going on in the back, woodland areas. We're planting some trees in a cul-de-sac, as well as around the perimeter of the site, which could also be used as a visual barrier. Site 3 example, more of a dense commercial or perhaps a light industrial site of some form, mostly impervious. In this case, we've put the detention for flood control that's under the pavement, so that's not going to help us with our MEP. And instead, we put a little bit of native plantings, maybe up in front of or next to one of the buildings. And then we have a variety of tree plantings scattered around the site. And we, again, can achieve our MEP area. 4th site, this would be an example of a road construction. So in this case, rebuilding the roadway, a boulevard section. And in this case, there are existing trees that are on the site after being reviewed by a certified arborist and shown to be in good health. Identified 14 trees that can be saved and counted towards the MEP. And when you're saving and counting existing trees towards the MEP, we're looking at aerial imaging and estimating what the canopy area is of each of those existing trees. We're supplementing those existing trees by adding additional trees, 3 mediums and 8 large in this example, and those are just scattered throughout the median area. So again, kind of a creative solution to achieving the MEP requirement. And that's really the what we have proposed for the MEP. We do have a survey, and I think somebody was going to put this in the chat, link to it. You can also use your phone. Really would like to encourage you to go to this site right now if you can. We're seeking feedback, as Lynn mentioned. These are draft proposed requirements or proposed ways of meeting the MEP requirement. And we really would like some feedback. So there's a short survey, multiple choice, that you can go to. You can scan a QR code on your phone, and you can also go to the hyperlink that's in the chat box.
Excuse me, Dan, just for anyone out there, so just open the chat function in Zoom if you haven't done so already. There's a link that's been provided to everyone to direct you to the survey. Thank you.
And if you have any questions or problems with the survey itself, just go ahead and type those into the chat, and we'll be taking a look at those. So hopefully everybody's going to that survey now, and you can multitask and fill out the survey as we finish up a few things here. Just to give you a quick update on our overall schedule, we're planning on collecting feedback and fine-tuning things here in January and February, and then we'll be revising or publishing the standards. Our target is to have that done in March. And then we do have questions for you. We're interested in, what your thoughts are on this. And this is in addition to the survey that hopefully everybody's filling out or has filled out by now. But some questions that we'd like some input specifically back from you, and today is a great time to talk about this. Are there concerns or conflicts that you see with existing ordinances? Maybe something around the use of native plantings or tree species. Are there any concerns that you have or conflicts with conservation areas as we've proposed? Are there additional information tools or processes that you would like to see us develop to help get the word out, to help people understand these requirements? Do you see any barriers or limitations to using enhanced detention basins? So let me just explain real quick what we mean by an enhanced detention basin. This is just an illustration of one, and this is where we're providing temporary storage on the surface, so it's exposed to the air and people, but we're doing so with kind of a wet system. So we like wet systems because they improve water quality better than dry systems. They can incorporate sometimes some wetland type functions, but we're looking at a lot of native plantings, a lot of filtering of the stormwater. You can incorporate some shrubs and trees. And then also it needs to have ways to get water out. Oftentimes, though, people like to have just dry basins that they can mow with a lawnmower and keep the turf grass cut. We'd really like to promote in the use of more of these enhanced detention basins, and wondering if anyone sees barriers or limitations on why people can't do these or aren't doing these. So these are some of the questions that we have for you. And Brian, correct me if I'm wrong, but this is when we're
well, so at this point this might be a little like the Wild Wild West here, but we're going to open up to the audience to address these specific questions that Dan posed to the audience. So if you would unmute yourselves if you have feedback for those specifically.
I would invite Lynn to turn her camera back on too, because she's going to help answer any questions.
So again, anyone in the audience, are there concerns or conflicts with existing ordinances in your communities? Please unmute yourselves and provide any feedback that you have.
Lynn and Dan, I have one question for you. In a case where I saw, for instance, you have box elder listed on one of your slides as a tree, many communities outright would prohibit that. In a case where a community has standards that in terms of a specific species, how would you handle that in your review?
Of course, the communities would have the ultimate say. So if they restrict a certain species, that would apply to the MEP. That's something we'll be looking for feedback on, and we can maybe send that to you, Jim, our draft list, just for some, and we can share it with the group as a way to get some additional feedback. But we use what we did for the tree list. We kind of looked at species that have been allowed, you know, whether it's DTE, consumers, our parks and recreation. And we even looked at Macomb County's, their green Macomb recommended tree species. And we kind of use that to come up with a list. And if it was at least on two of those species were on two of those lists, we added it. But of course, if there's anything that the community does not want to see, that would definitely have an impact on what trees are planted.
Okay, if anyone, you know, has specific information that they'd like to pass along or has questions after the presentation, feel free to email us questions and concerns or conflicts with existing ordinances that you have. Let's move on to the next question. Is anyone out in the audience, are there any additional information, tools, or processes you'd like to see developed to help assist with understanding the stormwater standards? I open it up to the audience.
Ryan, it's Paul Davis with Rochester Hills. I have a question. Might
Yeah.
not be specific to this topic, but it's one I just thought of. Is there any consideration that will be given to establishing credits for a community that might do something different? I'm thinking like a recent project that the city did where we did a road diet and reduced the overall imperviousness from a project. I don't, you know, would there be an ability to reserve some credits for doing a project on that could be applied to a different project in the community?
So I first want to start off by saying the MEP examples or best management practices that we talked about today are what we're considering easy pre-approved mechanisms. So if something else wants to be proposed, each community would have the opportunity to maybe either develop their own pre-approved best management practices. But when it comes to the credit idea, Paul, we have not pursued that. We're not opposed to credits, but we know there's a lot involved with it. And we currently just do not have the staffing to kind of really fully develop a credit approach. But that's something that we can continue a conversation on into the future. But at this point, no.
Anyone else in the audience?
Good morning. This is Stephanie Osborne from Giffords Webster. I have some work in with communities in Oakland County. I'm just thinking about another project that I have in Wayne County that has bioswales, and we found the bioswales have been in for a couple of years, and we found that the main challenge is maintenance. And I understand you're focused on the stormwater standards, but I'm curious, you know, if we want these things to be successful, if the county will be able to provide any resources for maintenance, you know, helping identifying people who are trained in native plants, because we've actually had people come to this one site who said they were trained in native plants and pulled everything and mowed, and we lost basically everything in the bioswale. So I'm wondering if the county will be able to provide supports to make these practices functional, you know, beyond their initial implementation.
So the short answer is we currently do not have anything planned for the maintenance aspect of it. But I did have a conversation with the Clinton River Watershed Council, and I know that there's a collaborative with all the watershed councils where they are going to be looking at sort of like a workforce development program when it comes to training workers on how to maintain and identify native plantings. So there are going to be mechanisms coming forward, moving forward. But that is something that if there's enough interest, we can help facilitate something like that.
Ryan, there's a question in the chat that actually relates to, I think, to the additional information. Is there or will there be an opportunity to do a sort of workshop with a mock site plan and site for us to get more information for hands-on learners?
We don't have anything planned, but that's something, if there's enough interest, we can look into.
I think it's important too to remind people that WRC offers pre-application meetings for real sites, and I think it's an underutilized available option to you. You just need to email the website on the screen, the bottom of the screen, to set up a pre-application meeting, and that can be done really early on in the site development process.
Hi, this is Jason from West Bloomfield Township. I had a question regarding how do you determine if runoff is being directed to a BMP? Because I've had cases where developers have argued that infiltration rate of 0.01 is infiltration. So if they're contributing, say, 100 square foot to a 10,000 square foot woodland, I don't think that would count. So I guess, have you guys discussed how you would define that?
That's an area that we are working on refining and making sure that we provide more details on. It's important to, not only define the drainage area coming to the practice, there needs to be some kind of a minimum threshold. We need enough water that it's meaningful. But we also don't want too much water going to a practice. And the practices that are accepting the runoff need to be designed or need to have the ability to accommodate that runoff, both receiving it as well as draining out too. We don't want to drown the plants. We need to have the BMP ready the next time it rains. So there needs to be a way to make sure that water can get out as well, since we can't count on the infiltration to occur. I mean, that's the whole premise of going the MEP. So Jason, thanks for the question. That is an area that we're working actively on providing more detail, and that'll be forthcoming shortly.
Hello, this is Mark Steck with the Village of Beverly Hills. I had a question, if I'm heard.
Yes, go ahead.
Excellent, thank you. So could you just go back, not literally go back in the slides, but there were a couple of those examples where you showed like a mechanical underground stormwater detention system, but they were not included in this. Could you just explain a little bit why those would not be? So just so you know, I'm relatively new to this whole actual engineering stuff. So, but yeah, like, why are those not included?
So our focus today is really zeroing in on specifically the volume reduction target or requirement for the site development. So Len went over early on that there's really 4 different requirements. The first one is kind of reducing the volume, and that's where we're trying to infiltrate the water. And then we also have a rate control for channel protection, a water quality control issue, and a flood control issue. So 4 requirements, we're focused on 1, and that's the volume reduction, reducing the amount of runoff from the impervious area. And in that case, because we can't count on infiltration, the detention sites don't really do anything for us. They don't reduce the amount of water. They just temporarily store it and release it at a slower rate.
Okay.
So that's why the detention basins don't count.
So it's about, I get it. So it's about, just like you said, reducing the overall amount of water that's making it into these systems, as opposed to just managing that flow of water. I think I got it. Thank you.
Yeah, and what we're looking at here, since we can't count on the infiltration, is these things like trees and native plantings. They really intercept a lot of water, rainfall. They evapotranspirate the water. I mean, the trees and plants drink the water and that becomes evaporated out. So they really do help reduce the volumes. And that's really what we're trying to focus on.
Cool, thank you very much.
Another question.
Sorry,
Oh,
just
sorry.
tagging on to that question. So my understanding though is that your underground detention, you don't typically accept that for infiltration, even if infiltration, if the soils show that infiltration is possible.
Lynn, I can take that one if
Is
you
that
want.
correct?
Sure.
Yeah, so you're correct. In the standards, we say that we won't accept infiltration for underground detention systems. However, I've had a handful of projects over the past year or so with very, very high infiltration rates. So on a case-by-case basis, depending on what the rates are, we've been accepting infiltration for underground detention systems with the exception of ensuring that we have kind of like a dual layer TSS control in place for it.
Okay, thank you.
This is Angela Heisinger from Bloomfield Township. I guess I just have more of a comment with respect to this process and how it would align with our approval process here at the township. Typically, landscaping plans are part of and approved under our site plan approval process, and we don't typically require infiltration testing until it gets to time of review of the engineering plans, which comes after site plan approval. So if we discover that at the engineering plan review process that the infiltration requirements are less than that 0.24 inch per hour, and they need to meet these MEP requirements through the use of additional tree plantings, then that would almost require that the plans go back before our board through a revised or amended site plan review process. So it almost seems like us as a township would have to look at adjusting how we do our requirements for these different plan review processes. We'd either have to require infiltration testing up front at the site plan review phase, or have the engineer, if they believe that they're not going to meet the infiltration requirement, design their site to meet these MEP requirements at time of site plan review. So I think that might be just, hopefully that all made sense, but that might be an issue that we run into moving forward with these MEP requirements once they're adopted, is how we're going to accommodate that into our current review processes for site plan and engineering.
So that's a really good point, Angie, because when we go through, and that's kind of what we mentioned earlier in this whole thing, is by the time we're seeing it at a stormwater engineering perspective, a lot of approvals have already gone through. And so it would be recommended, if communities can, to require those infiltration tests early on, because that really sets a lot of requirements and an understanding for the developer and site engineer of what they're going to need to do. And it will streamline, their approval process in the long run. So it is highly recommended.
Okay, thanks for the feedback. I think I'll have that, consider that with our planning department and other staff in my department, and maybe that's something we require moving forward.
Yeah, Southfield would be in the exact same position because the landscape approval is part of the site plan. And oftentimes the engineering is not fully underway at the time of site plan approval.
I got a technical question. And if I missed it, I apologize. So this is for sites under the detention threshold or the infiltration threshold. If you meet the MEP requirements, do you get any credit to your volume, your CPVC, like or no? No. Okay, so this is in addition to that CPVC additional volume requirement if you can't infiltrate.
This is, yeah, if you're unable to do the infiltration requirements, meet that require, and you have like the poor infiltration rate, this is the, what we're requiring to improve the site and achieve that volume reducing best management practice requirement.
But you don't get the volume requirement like outlined in the stormwater standards, like you wouldn't get that. Okay.
No.
Back to the, oh, go ahead.
This is Kyle Wilson from SME. I just had a question about when it comes to the conservation areas, if you're going to use trees or a wetland, has there been consideration for maybe some other types of professionals like a professional surveyor or landscape architect to be able to review those areas? I just see it as like another, other types of professionals that aren't really staffed for a lot of consulting firms. So it's just more contracts and professionals that the owner would have to hire to evaluate those types of areas versus, they're probably already working with professional landscape architects and engineers and surveyors.
When it comes to surveyors, I mean, there's probably a big variance on knowledge on maybe native, not native plants, but like invasive species, or the quality of the wetlands. So we can take your comment into consideration, but we kind of felt most confident with the requirements that we listed for the professionals reviewing the health and well-being of the conservation areas.
About any other communities out there that feel there's potential conflicts or concerns or would like to see other tools or information developed to assist in helping them implement these processes. Okay. And so at this point, I think we've gotten quite a few questions intermixed. So if folks have additional feedback, please, get that to us. In the meantime, I do have some questions that were directed to me in the chat.
As do I, Ryan. So
yeah.
Why don't you go ahead with yours and then I'll go with mine.
Perfect. So question, do you have a list or where can we find the 23 communities that have adopted into the drafts for the MEP standards?
I don't have it readily available, so you can either contact me or use the email on the screen and we can send it out. We obtained, just so you know, we obtained that information through a survey that we sent out to the municipalities, and that number of 22 is based on the responses we received through that survey. But I'm happy to share the information.
Got it. Thank you. And then next question, how would you ensure that trees stay in place post-construction if they're used for MEP credit?
So the trees would be part of your stormwater post-construction maintenance, your O&M. So if, as you would put in a bioretention system, your trees should be listed as part of your best management practices for post-construction. And so as whoever is responsible for ensuring the maintenance and O&M of those would be the ones that would go through on either. I mean, trees are easy. I think you can use aerial desktop analysis to see if they're still in place. But it would be part of your post-construction requirements to verify whether these are still in place. And one thing that we didn't really highlight, but is important for these best management practices, that they need to be in an dedicated open space. So whether it's the right of way or an area that's dedicated as open space, you wouldn't want to put a tree to meet a requirement that maybe is in the backyard of a residential lot, because it's up to the residential homeowner to maybe decide whether it's going to stay or be removed. So we're trying to require that these be in dedicated open spaces or right of ways.
Okay, thank you. That was the last question I had, Jim.
Okay, any thoughts on increasing the ratio for green roof to help encourage the use of that practice?
When it comes to green roofs, I don't know what incentive we can really put out there to increase the adoption of them. I mean, we can look at the increasing the ratio, but I think it's unlike some of the other best management practices that we propose, with trees and native plantings, the soil conditions improve over time. You have the root system that's allowing the soil to take in more water, where a vegetated roof is kind of more, it just keeps at that same level of collecting water. So we can look at it. We're open to feedback.
Okay. Next question. The road commission is limited to a linear system within right-of-way. Are there known designs for detention that can accommodate a linear system? And also, how easily can they be replaced or repaired should utilities need to dig them up at a later date?
I'll let Dan take this one because he might have more experience.
Roads are a challenge. There's no question about it. You can do things like inline pipe storage for detention. Now, today's presentation was really focused on the MEP for when you have poor draining soils. And in those cases, that's where we're promoting the saving of existing trees as an important way to meet that MEP. But I think the question was, talking about the detention, and that's where something like inline pipe storage, you can do storage underneath the curb line area in a variety of formats, an aggregate or an open pipe of some form, swales on either side of the road. You just have to kind of get creative on putting the water wherever you can. And we know and recognize that it is a challenge on linear roadway projects.
And then the second part of that question was, how easily can they be replaced or repaired should utilities need to dig them up at a later date?
Yeah, certainly any kind of, again, the focus of the presentation on the MEP area, the trees, if you have an existing tree that was credited for the MEP, as Lynn mentioned, that tree now becomes part of your post-construction stormwater design. And so if you need to remove that tree in order to take care of underground utilities, then you have a responsibility to put the tree back in the same location or nearby in order to still have that same equivalent MEP area. And in the case of, subsurface detention, that's a major challenge with underground utilities and becomes quite a major construction project because you'll have to, dig up the road and the utilities and the basins. And so that becomes a whole new project at that point.
Okay. A comment bordering on a question. I'm wondering if mandatory minimum parking requirements across counties' communities is a large hindrance to implementing these BMPs.
I certainly see that sometimes the minimum parking requirements can become a hindrance. I know a lot of planners, and I know from a stormwater management perspective, we would rather see maximum parking limits, not minimums. But that can become quite a controversial topic. So that could be a whole nother presentation.
Okay. Next question. Most communities have required landscaping. Seems that developers would be getting credit for MEP without doing anything additional. Shouldn't we require the tree plantings that go above and beyond the standard requirements?
So it's a good comment. That's something that we could certainly take a look at and understand further. One comment with that though is as Len mentioned, that these, when we're doing the tree plantings for MEP purposes, they need to be placed in open space areas that are accessible for long-term observations and replacements as needed.
And it would be helpful maybe if whoever wrote that question could add the specific communities that maybe have landscape requirements that maybe takes away the benefit of this MEP. I guess what we're kind of also looking at is we want to support existing requirements too. You know, if we can make some landscaping meet stormwater purposes, we don't see anything wrong with that. And again, these requirements only come into effect if you cannot infiltrate and you receive that waiver.
Could I ask
Yeah,
one?
I think the point of the question was that with communities having landscape requirements, essentially you're double dipping. And is that an issue, or should we be looking at that relative to the county standards?
I'm not sure that it is double dipping in my perspective. I mean, you're meeting the landscaping requirements for one set of objectives, and if you can meet the stormwater requirements with the same BMP, then why not?
Yeah, I mean, we're considering these volume reducing best management practices. So if communities are requiring this as part of the landscape plan, I think our benefits are going to be greater than what we're even anticipating countywide.
Okay. Next question is, where does Water Resources Commission CMD stand currently on accepting green infrastructure as a part of Chapter 18 drains?
Are they asking whether it will include green infrastructure part of?
Where does Water Resources Commission CMD stand currently on accepting green infrastructure as a part of Chapter 18 drains?
So the stance is if it's part of the stormwater requirements, of course, we would accept it to meet our standards. Where we did have some issues is where maybe a community had the development add something, but they had poor infiltrating soils, and it was just kind of like a pilot to see, you know, how it would work. In those situations where they're not meeting the standard, but they're also being imposed, those are the ones that we're not taking in as part of the Chapter 18. But if the green stormwater infrastructure is being done to meet stormwater requirements, yes, of course, they will be part of the Chapter 18.
Okay. Next question. Do you know if this is being implemented because of MS4 permitting requirements?
Yes.
Yeah. Yes, we know, and the answer is yes.
Yes.
Okay. And last question, are there certain trees, native plantings that thrive in poor infiltrating soils that we should encourage?
Yes, but I'm a silly engineer, and I think your landscape architects and arborists are probably better suited to provide specific information on those.
Yeah, and then really quick, Jim, going back to that previous question about whether this is to meet the MS4 permit requirements. So if you looked at the standards, we just had that general statement that if you receive a waiver, you have to implement these best volume reducing best management practices to the maximum extent practicable. Well, what we've been receiving over the last 3 years is what does that mean? And so this was developed in hopes to provide guidance, better guidance to developers and site engineers of what that means to them as they move forward. We wanted them to have some idea what it would take to meet the requirement in the site design process.
Okay. That is the last question that I had in the chat, Ryan.
Great. Lynn and Dan, I just encourage you real quickly to check, open the chat window in Zoom and see if anyone directed a question to you. Otherwise, if anyone has a question further, please type it in the chat or feel free to unmute yourself at this time to pose that question. we'll wait a few minutes here and go ahead.
I have a question. This is Kyle Wilson from SME again. Has there been any consideration in maybe having a separate percentage requirement for new development versus redevelopment sites? Like on a new development site, I think it's a little bit easier to implement some of this stuff, but on an existing site where there's already a lot of existing infrastructure, trying to reconfigure things and find the space for some of this might be challenging, especially if it's an older site.
So again, this is the maximum extent practicable. This is our goal for meeting that requirement, but if there are, circumstances that you just can't work around, we can have a conversation, but that would be on a case-by-case situation.
I have another follow-up question if I could.
Sure.
So going back to the trees, if I remember correctly, wasn't a larger, more mature tree given more credit than like a new planting tree, a small 3-inch caliper or something like that? Is that accurate?
Yeah, we have, what we're proposing is existing trees within the public right of way that are being saved to meet the MEP. You're measuring the canopy based on, either an aerial imagery, or an arborist can go out and measure the canopy area. But if you're planting new, then you're using, the trees are then categorized in either small, medium, or large, and we've assigned an area for each of the new tree sizes.
So my question was getting to, so I see that back on there, it says height at maturity. So what I was thinking of is, say you got credit for existing trees, and we all know what happens with trees. They die, they fall. And then once you plant a new tree to replace that, it seems to me that at that point, then the system will be underperforming, because now you're putting a 3-inch caliper replacing a large mature tree that was maybe doing more with a much smaller tree, and it'll take a long time for that tree to reach that same benefit as the other tree. But seems like it's based on the height at maturity, not at planting. Is that correct?
It is, and the MEP area per tree, that was actually estimated assuming a 10-year growth cycle.
Okay.
And then existing trees, if they get cut down, maybe for utility repairs or something, you would take the MEP area canopy of that existing tree, and then you'd be required to plant the equivalent MEP area again. So if you have a fully mature tree that has a huge crown, then you might need to come in and plant several new trees, not just one.
I could see that presenting a couple spatial challenges, where you might have to open the whole project up to a new landscape plan or something in the future to accommodate, 3 replacement trees where one was, so they can grow healthily. Thank you.
Okay, we are after 11 o'clock, so I just want to thank everyone for joining us. Also, just a reminder, the session is being recorded and will be posted and available on our website. If you have further questions, feel free to email Jim and I or Lynn and Dan. Anything that you send us, we'll get over to those guys too. Any feedback you have for them, that are looking for how this impacts communities, their processes, and looking to get information back on that. So again, thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time.